The morning of June 7, 1944, dawned grey and cold over the Normandy coast. Private First Class James Robinson of the 6th Quartermaster Battalion crouched in a foxhole barely 300 meters from Omaha Beach, his hands trembling, not from fear of the German forces dug into the hedgerows ahead, but from the weight of what he carried. In his grip was an M1 Garand rifle, standard issue for American infantry. What wasn't standard was that his weapon had been deliberately loaded with blank ammunition by his own supply sergeant, a man from Alabama who had made his feelings about Negro soldiers carrying live rounds abundantly clear. Robinson was there to carry supplies, to dig latrines, to do anything except fight. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 72 hours, that blank-loaded rifle would become the instrument through which 33 German soldiers would cease their participation in the war, and Private First Class Robinson would transform from a man his own army refused to trust into a legend whispered about in both American and German field reports. The United States Army of 1944 existed in a state of profound contradiction. While fighting a war against tyranny and oppression overseas, it maintained strict segregation policies that relegated over 1 million African American servicemen to support roles, manual labor, and supply operations. The official policy, shaped by decades of institutional bias and War Department reports claiming that Negro soldiers lacked the intelligence and courage for combat, ensured that black units received the oldest equipment, the least training, and the most dangerous non-combat assignments. In the 6th Quartermaster Battalion, this policy manifested in a particularly cruel form. White officers, many from southern states, feared that armed black soldiers represented a threat not to the German forces, but to the racial order they intended to preserve after the war ended. Sergeant William Hutchins, the supply officer responsible for ammunition distribution to Robinson's platoon, had served 3 years in the army without once questioning the rightness of his convictions. He had grown up in Montgomery, where the social order was clear and unchallenged. When he was assigned to oversee a Negro supply unit, he viewed it as a temporary inconvenience, a posting to endure until he could return to a proper white infantry company. On the evening of June 6th, as the 6th Quartermaster Battalion prepared to move up from the beach to establish supply lines for the advancing infantry, Hutchins made a decision that he believed was both prudent and necessary. The Negro soldiers under his supervision would carry rifles for appearance's sake, but those rifles would be loaded exclusively with blank cartridges. Real ammunition, he reasoned, was too valuable to waste on men who would never be called upon to use it, and too dangerous to entrust to soldiers he fundamentally did not trust. Private First Class James Robinson had enlisted in January of 1943, 3 months after his 23rd birthday. He came from Philadelphia, where his father worked as a Pullman porter, and his mother cleaned houses in the white neighborhoods of Chestnut Hill. He had completed 2 years at Lincoln University before the draft notice arrived, and unlike many of his contemporaries who sought deferments or ways to avoid service, Robinson had reported willingly. He believed, with a faith that now seemed almost childish in its innocence, that military service would prove something essential about Negro Americans, would demonstrate a patriotism and capability that would make the old prejudices impossible to sustain. Robinson remembered the day he had told his father about his decision to enlist rather than wait for the draft. They had been sitting on the front steps of their narrow row house on Diamond Street, watching neighborhood children play stickball in the summer heat. His father had listened in silence, his weathered hands folded in his lap, and when Robinson finished explaining his reasoning, the old man had simply nodded. "You think they'll treat you fair because you volunteer?" his father had asked. His voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of decades spent serving white passengers on trains, decades of swallowing insults and maintaining dignity in the face of casual cruelty. "You think putting on that uniform will make them see you different?" Robinson had not known how to answer that question then, and he still did not know 16 months later. His father had been right, of course. The uniform changed nothing. The army had systematically dismantled whatever faith Robinson had possessed over 16 months of training and service. He had been called every variation of slur the English language offered, had heard them casually deployed by officers and enlisted men alike, as though such language was simply the natural vocabulary for addressing Negro soldiers. He had been assigned to latrine duty, while less qualified white soldiers received technical training in radio operation, vehicle maintenance, and weapon systems. He had watched Negro units receive equipment so old and poorly maintained that it regularly failed during exercises, then heard white officers cite those failures as evidence of Negro incompetence. The training itself had been a study in contradictions. Robinson's basic training took place at Camp Lee in Virginia, where the segregated facilities ensured that Negro and white recruits never interacted except when white units were given priority access to the rifle ranges, the mess halls, and the training equipment. The instructors, all white, ranged from professional soldiers who taught effectively despite their prejudices to outright racists who seemed to take pleasure in making training as difficult and humiliating as possible for their Negro students. Robinson had excelled at marksmanship, consistently scoring in the top 5% of all recruits at the camp, but his scores were often dismissed or ignored. One instructor had told him directly that his accuracy was probably just luck, that Negro soldiers lacked the intelligence and discipline for consistent marksmanship. But Robinson had persisted, had maintained his focus and his standards, even when the institution surrounding him refused to acknowledge his capabilities. He had helped other soldiers in his unit improve their shooting, had volunteered for extra duties, had done everything the Army said it valued in soldiers, and none of it had mattered. When assignments were distributed after basic training, Robinson and the other Negro soldiers were sent to quartermaster units to supply operations to manual labor battalions. The white soldiers, including those who had scored lower than Robinson in every measurable category, were assigned to combat units, to technical specialties, to positions where their capabilities would be developed and utilized. The blank ammunition in his rifle represented the culmination of every insult and indignity he had endured. Hutchins had distributed the rounds during the pre-dawn hours of June 7th, moving through the positions where Negro soldiers waited for orders to advance inland. Robinson had been awake, checking his gear by the light of a shielded flashlight, when the sergeant arrived at his foxhole. "You won't be needing real rounds, boy," Hutchins said, his voice carrying the casual certainty of someone who had never questioned his right to make such decisions. "You're here to carry boxes and dig holes. That rifle is just for show. Keep it clean and stay out of the way when the real soldiers do their work." Robinson said nothing. He had learned that silence was safer than protest, that any objection would be recorded as insubordination and used to justify further restrictions on Negro soldiers. He took the magazines of blank cartridges and loaded his weapon, feeling the familiar weight settle into something hollow and meaningless. Around him, other soldiers from the 6th Quartermaster Battalion received the same treatment, the same ammunition, the same dismissive instructions. They exchanged glances, but no words. What was there to say that they had not already said 1,000 times in the barracks, in the mess halls, in the long hours of manual labor that filled their days? The tactical situation facing the American forces on June 7th was complex and dangerous. The initial landings on Omaha Beach had succeeded, but at horrific cost. Thousands of soldiers had died in the surf and on the sand, cut down by German defensive positions that the pre-invasion bombardment had failed to neutralize. The surviving units had pushed inland, but their advance had created long, vulnerable supply lines that stretched back to the beach. German forces, though retreating, remained well organized and dangerous. They had spent 4 years fortifying the Norman countryside, transforming every hedgerow and stone farmhouse into a defensive position. Small units of German soldiers, often no more than a dozen men with a single machine gun, could hold up entire American companies for hours or days. The 6th Quartermaster Battalion received orders to move inland at 0800 hours. Their mission was straightforward in description, but treacherous in execution. They would transport ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel from the beach depots to forward positions, using a network of narrow farm roads that wound through terrain perfectly suited for ambushes. The battalion consisted of 4 companies, each with approximately 200 men, organized into platoons of 40 soldiers. Robinson's platoon, designated 3rd Platoon of Baker Company, had responsibility for a route that ran northwest from the beach through a series of small villages with names like Formigny and Trevière. Lieutenant Robert Chen, the only non-white officer in the battalion, commanded 3rd Platoon. Chen was Chinese-American from San Francisco, and he occupied an ambiguous position in the Army's racial hierarchy. He was allowed to lead Negro soldiers, but was never considered for positions in white units. He had graduated from officer training with honors, spoke 3 languages fluently, and possessed a tactical mind that his superiors consistently overlooked in favor of less qualified white officers. Chen understood, with a clarity born from his own experiences of discrimination, exactly what Hutchins had done with the ammunition. He had protested to the battalion commander, a career officer from Virginia named Major Thornton, and had been told in terms that permitted no misunderstanding that the ammunition policy would stand, that it was within the supply officer's discretion, and that Chen's commission would be reviewed if he raised the issue again. So Chen said nothing more to his superiors, but he gathered 3rd Platoon together before they moved out, assembling them in a bomb crater that offered concealment from the German positions to the south. "I know what rounds you've been given," Chen said, his voice low and intense. "I know what that means, and I know what it says about what they think of you. But we have a job to do, and we're going to do it better than any white unit in this army. You keep your eyes open, you follow orders, and you watch each other's backs. We're going to bring those supplies through, and we're going to show them exactly what we're capable of." Robinson listened to Chen's words and felt something shift inside him. It was not hope exactly. Hope required believing that fairness was possible, that the system could change. What he felt was closer to defiance, a determination to excel, not because it would change anyone's mind, but because it was the only form of dignity left to him. 3rd Platoon moved out in a convoy of 8 trucks, each vehicle loaded with supplies and driven by soldiers who had received minimal training on the vehicles. The Army's motor pool schools were segregated, and Negro drivers learned their skills through trial and error rather than systematic instruction. Robinson rode in the 4th truck, sitting among crates of ammunition and rations, his useless rifle propped between his knees. The convoy moved slowly, rarely exceeding 15 miles per hour, navigating roads cratered by artillery and clogged with military traffic moving in both directions. They passed columns of infantry heading toward the fighting, saw medics carrying wounded soldiers back toward the beach, watched engineers working to clear roadblocks and repair bridges. The landscape looked surreal in the grey morning light. Fields and orchards torn apart by explosives, farmhouses burning, bodies lying in ditches. At approximately 1000 hours, the convoy reached a crossroads 2 kilometers south of Formigny. Lieutenant Chen, riding in the lead vehicle, called a halt to check his maps against the actual terrain. The roads in Normandy rarely matched their cartographic representations. Centuries of agricultural use had created a maze of farm tracks and hedgerow-lined lanes that looked identical to each other. Chen needed to verify their route before proceeding, to ensure they did not take a wrong turn that would lead them into German-held territory or, equally dangerous, into an area scheduled for artillery bombardment. Robinson climbed down from his truck to stretch his legs, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from hours of sitting on hard wooden benches. Other soldiers did the same, forming small groups, smoking cigarettes, speaking in low voices. The tension was palpable. Every man in 3rd Platoon understood that they were exposed, vulnerable, that German forces could be observing them from any of the surrounding hedgerows. The blank ammunition in their rifles felt like a death sentence, a guarantee that if fighting started, they would have no way to defend themselves or the supplies they carried. Then Chen returned to the convoy, his expression grim. "Road ahead is blocked," he announced. "There was fighting here yesterday. Wrecked vehicles, probably mines. We need to take an alternate route through those fields to the west. Stay alert. Intelligence reports German stragglers in this area." The convoy turned off the main road onto a narrow farm track, barely wide enough for the trucks. Hedgerows rose on both sides, dense walls of earth and vegetation that limited visibility to a few meters. The trucks moved in single file, their engines straining in low gear. Robinson felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of terrain where ambushes happened, where small German units could inflict heavy casualties and disappear before reinforcements arrived. They had traveled perhaps half a kilometer down the farm track when the first truck in the convoy suddenly lurched to a stop. The driver, a soldier named Washington from 3rd Platoon, stood up in his seat and pointed toward the left side of the road. Chen jumped down and ran forward, and Robinson saw him kneel beside something on the ground. Other soldiers moved up to see what had caused the halt, and Robinson followed, his rifle in his hands, despite its uselessness. What Chen had found was a wounded German soldier, probably no more than 18 years old, lying in the ditch beside the road. He had been there for some time. Judging by the dried blood on his uniform and the way he moved feebly when Chen approached. The German soldier's eyes went wide with fear when he saw the American troops gathering around him, and he tried to raise his hands in surrender, but the effort seemed to exhaust him. The young German's uniform was torn and stained, bearing the insignia of an infantry regiment that American intelligence had identified as part of the Coastal Defense Forces. His helmet lay several meters away, probably knocked off during whatever action had left him wounded and separated from his unit. He was muttering something in German, the same phrases repeated over and over, and Robinson could hear the desperation and fear in the boy's voice, even without understanding the words. Chen spoke to the German in fluent German, his tone calm and reassuring. The lieutenant's facility with languages had been another source of tension with his superiors. Some officers resented that a Chinese American could speak German, French, and Italian in addition to English, as though linguistic ability represented an unfair advantage rather than a valuable skill. But Chen used his language abilities whenever possible, understanding that communication could prevent violence, could transform enemies into something more complicated and human. The wounded German soldier responded to Chen's words, his expression changing from terror to confusion to something that might have been relief. He was asking for water, Chen later explained, and for assurance that he would not be executed. The German military had told its soldiers that American forces, particularly Negro soldiers, committed atrocities against prisoners. The propaganda had described American troops as barbaric and uncivilized, as soldiers who fought without honor or mercy. The wounded German had expected to be executed or tortured. Instead, he found himself being treated by American medics who handled him as gently as they would have treated one of their own wounded. Robinson watched this interaction and felt a strange mixture of emotions. The German soldier was the enemy, the representative of a regime that had conquered most of Europe and committed atrocities on a scale that defied comprehension. But he was also just a frightened teenager who was bleeding in a ditch, who wanted water and reassurance, who probably had parents somewhere in Germany who were terrified for his safety. Chen turned to the platoon medic, a soldier named Johnson, who had trained as a veterinary assistant before the war and had learned battlefield medicine through necessity rather than formal instruction. "Johnson, check him out," Chen ordered. "See if he can be moved." Johnson knelt beside the German soldier and began a quick examination, checking for wounds, feeling for broken bones. The German flinched at each touch, but he did not resist. After a few minutes, Johnson looked up at Chen. "He's lost blood, but nothing immediately life-threatening," Johnson reported. "Looks like he got separated from his unit during the fighting yesterday. If we can get him back to the beach, he'll probably make it." Chen nodded slowly, thinking through the implications. The convoy was already behind schedule. They had supplies that needed to reach forward units. Taking time to evacuate a wounded prisoner would delay them further, would increase their exposure to German forces. But Chen's face showed no hesitation when he made his decision. "Load him in the last truck," Chen said. "We'll drop him at the first aid station we pass. No one gets left to die in a ditch, not on my watch." Hutchins would never have made that choice, Robinson thought as he helped lift the German soldier into a truck. The supply sergeant, with his convictions about proper treatment of enemies and inferiors, would have left the wounded man where he lay. But Chen was different. Chen saw the German soldier as another human being in need of help, not as an opportunity to demonstrate dominance or cruelty. The convoy resumed its movement through the narrow farm track. The hedgerows seemed to close in on both sides, and Robinson felt increasingly certain that they were being watched. His training, limited as it had been, taught him to look for signs of enemy presence: broken branches, disturbed earth, unusual shadows in the vegetation. He saw none of these things, but the feeling of being observed persisted. They reached another intersection, where the farm track joined a slightly wider road. Chen called another halt to verify their position, and as the truck stopped, Robinson heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a voice speaking in German, coming from somewhere ahead and to the right. He could not see the speaker, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was giving orders, coordinating positions, preparing for action. Robinson moved toward the front of the convoy, where Chen stood with his map. "Lieutenant," Robinson said quietly, keeping his voice low, "there's someone in those hedgerows ahead, speaking German. Sounds like they're setting up an ambush." Chen's expression tightened. He listened for a moment, head cocked, and then nodded. "How many do you think?" "Hard to say, sir, but more than a few based on what I'm hearing." Chen made his decision with characteristic speed. "Everyone out of the trucks," he ordered, his voice carrying down the line of vehicles. "Take cover in the ditches, leave the engines running. Johnson, get that German prisoner out where they can see him." The platoon moved with practiced efficiency, soldiers dropping into the ditches on both sides of the road, taking whatever cover the terrain offered. Robinson found himself pressed against the earthen wall of a hedgerow, his blank-loaded rifle in his hands, feeling utterly exposed and helpless. If German forces opened fire, 3rd Platoon would have no effective way to respond. They would be slaughtered, their bodies left beside their burning trucks while the Germans took the supplies they had died trying to deliver. Then Chen did something that Robinson would later recognize as either brilliance or madness, or perhaps both. He walked into the middle of the road, fully exposed, and began calling out in German. His voice was loud and clear, and though Robinson could not understand the words, he could hear the tone. Chen was negotiating, was offering something, was trying to forestall the violence that seemed inevitable. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Norman countryside was silent, except for the idling engines of the trucks and the distant sound of artillery fire from somewhere to the north. Robinson's heart hammered in his chest. He was acutely aware of his blank ammunition, of the complete uselessness of his weapon if the German soldiers chose violence over negotiation. Around him, other soldiers from 3rd Platoon held similar positions, their faces showing the same mixture of determination and fear that Robinson felt. Then, slowly, German soldiers began to emerge from the hedgerows. They came out cautiously, weapons still in their hands but pointed at the ground, their body language conveying exhaustion rather than aggression. Robinson counted them as they appeared, 5, then 10, then 15. They wore the field-grey uniforms of regular army infantry, and they carried weapons that ranged from bolt-action Mauser rifles to one very nasty-looking MG-42 machine gun that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute and had been responsible for countless American casualties since the invasion began. The German soldiers looked nothing like the propaganda posters that had covered American cities during the war mobilization. Those posters had depicted German forces as brutal, mechanized, superhuman in their efficiency and cruelty. The men emerging from the hedgerows looked human in the most mundane way imaginable. Their faces showed exhaustion, hunger, and weariness. Their uniforms were dirty and torn. Several had bandages wrapped around minor wounds. They moved with the careful deliberation of men who had been fighting and retreating for days, who had seen their defensive lines collapse under overwhelming Allied firepower, who knew that the war was moving toward a conclusion that did not favor them. Their ages varied considerably. The youngest appeared to be perhaps 17, barely old enough to shave. The oldest was the sergeant, a man who looked to be in his mid-30s with the weather-beaten face of someone who had spent years outdoors. Between these extremes were farmers and shopkeepers, mechanics and students, ordinary men who had been conscripted into service and trained to fight for a cause that many of them had never fully embraced. The German soldiers formed a loose semicircle around the road, their weapons pointed at the American trucks, but without the aggressive posture that would have indicated imminent attack. They were assessing the situation, trying to determine whether the Americans represented an opportunity or a threat. A German sergeant, the oldest of the group, stepped forward to speak with Chen. His bearing suggested military experience, possibly service in the previous war, and he carried himself with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the obvious desperation of his situation. The conversation was brief and conducted entirely in German. Robinson watched as Chen pointed to the wounded German soldier, now sitting propped against one of the trucks, then gestured toward his own unarmed men. The German sergeant listened, his expression unreadable, and then spoke at length, occasionally pointing toward the north and west. Finally, Chen turned back to his platoon. "Lower your weapons," he ordered. "They're accepting surrender." Robinson blinked, confused. "Who's surrendering?" "They are," Chen said, and for the first time that day Robinson saw him smile. "Their unit is cut off. No supplies, no ammunition, no communication with their command. They were planning to ambush us for our food and medical supplies, but when they saw we were helping their wounded man, their sergeant decided to negotiate instead. He's offering to surrender his entire unit in exchange for food, water, and a promise of proper treatment as prisoners." The mathematics of the situation struck Robinson immediately. 3rd Platoon had approximately 40 men with blank ammunition, facing at least 15 German soldiers, with live rounds and a machine gun. If the Germans had chosen violence instead of surrender, the outcome would have been catastrophic for the Americans. Only Chen's quick thinking, his linguistic ability, and perhaps most importantly, the decision to help a wounded enemy soldier had prevented a slaughter. The process of taking 15 German soldiers into custody consumed nearly an hour. Chen radioed back to battalion headquarters to report the situation and received authorization to evacuate the prisoners along with the wounded German soldier. The German sergeant, whose name was revealed to be Feldwebel Klaus Zimmermann, proved cooperative and even helpful, providing information about German positions and minefields in the surrounding area. His men, once they had been given food and water, seemed almost relieved to be out of the fighting. They were farmers and shopkeepers, family men who had been conscripted into service, and they showed no ideological fervor for the cause they had been ordered to defend. Zimmermann spoke briefly with Chen in German, and Chen translated for Robinson and the other platoon leaders. He says they've been retreating for 3 days straight. No sleep, no hot food, watching their friends get killed by your aircraft and artillery. He says the only thing keeping them going was the hope that they might make it back to their own lines. But when they saw you helping that wounded boy, he says it made him realize that not all Americans are the same, that maybe surrender wasn't the shameful thing their officers told them it would be. Robinson felt a complex mixture of emotions hearing those words: pride that his platoon's actions had possibly saved lives on both sides, anger that it required an extraordinary act of mercy to overcome the dehumanizing propaganda that both sides used to justify killing, and a deep, bitter irony that Negro soldiers, denied full humanity by their own army, had demonstrated more humanity toward the enemy than many white American units would have shown. The convoy resumed its journey with 15 German prisoners sitting in the trucks alongside the American supplies. The wounded German soldier, whose name they learned was Private Heinrich Müller, received additional medical attention from Johnson and seemed to stabilize. The presence of the prisoners changed the atmosphere in 3rd Platoon. The German soldiers were not monsters or abstractions. They were tired young men who spoke quietly among themselves, who accepted their rations gratefully, who looked at photographs of wives and children when they thought no one was watching. But the complications of that first encounter were only beginning to unfold. The convoy had traveled another 3 kilometers when they encountered a more serious problem. The road ahead was completely blocked by a destroyed tank, probably hit by Allied aircraft the previous day. The wreckage was too large to move or drive around, and the surrounding terrain was too soft for the heavy trucks to navigate off-road. Chen studied the situation and made another quick decision. We'll have to unload the supplies and carry them forward on foot. The forward units need this ammunition and food. We can come back for the trucks once engineers clear the road. The process of unloading began immediately. Soldiers formed human chains, passing crates and boxes from the trucks to assembly points beside the road. Robinson worked alongside everyone else, his muscles straining under the weight of ammunition boxes and ration crates. The German prisoners at Zimmermann's direction helped with the work, and Robinson found himself passing boxes directly to a young German soldier who could not have been more than 19 years old. They did not speak, but they made eye contact, and Robinson saw in that young German's face the same exhaustion and determination he felt in his own body. They had nearly completed the unloading when the situation became exponentially more dangerous. A single German soldier appeared on the road ahead, running toward them with the desperate speed of someone fleeing pursuit. He was yelling something in German, and Robinson saw Zimmermann's face go pale. The Feldwebel shouted something to Chen, who immediately ordered everyone to take cover. "He says there's a German patrol coming," Chen translated urgently. "Not regular army, military police. They're hunting deserters and stragglers, executing anyone they find who's abandoned their position. They're about 5 minutes behind this soldier." Robinson's mind raced through the implications. If a German military police unit encountered 3rd Platoon, they would find 15 surrendered German soldiers in American custody. Those soldiers would be viewed as deserters by the military police, subject to immediate execution under German military law. The military police would also see the American unit as legitimate targets, which meant a firefight was inevitable, a firefight that 3rd Platoon could not win with blank ammunition. Chen understood the situation instantly. "All American personnel, defensive positions," he ordered. "German prisoners, stay in the trucks and stay down. Zimmermann, tell your men to stay quiet and out of sight." Robinson took a position behind an overturned supply crate, his useless rifle braced against the wood. Around him, other soldiers from 3rd Platoon did the same, creating the appearance of a defensive perimeter. Chen moved among them, speaking quietly, reinforcing the illusion that they were armed and ready to fight. But Robinson could see the tension in the lieutenant's face, could read the calculation happening behind his eyes. They were about to face combat with weapons that could not harm the enemy. The only question was how many of them would die before the military police realized the Americans were effectively unarmed. The fleeing German soldier reached their position, and Chen pulled him down behind cover. The soldier was hyperventilating, clearly terrified, and he spoke in rapid German to Zimmermann. The Feldwebel translated for Chen in broken English, his voice urgent. "He says the military police unit is 12 men. They have 2 vehicles with mounted machine guns. They are maybe 3 minutes away. They have been executing soldiers all morning. They will kill all of us, German and American." Chen's response was immediate and revealed why, despite all the discrimination he had faced, he had earned the respect of every soldier in 3rd Platoon. He grabbed his radio handset and called for artillery support, giving coordinates for a position 500 meters down the road. But artillery could take 10 or 15 minutes to arrive, and they had perhaps 3 minutes before the German military police appeared. The mathematics of survival were grim. Then Robinson did something that surprised even himself. He stood up from his position and walked over to where the German prisoners sat in the trucks. "Do any of you have ammunition?" he asked, looking directly at Zimmermann. "Real ammunition for rifles like these?" Zimmermann stared at him for a long moment, processing the implications of the question. Then understanding dawned in his eyes. He spoke rapidly to his men, and several of them reached into their pockets and pouches, pulling out magazines and loose rounds for their Mauser rifles. The ammunition was not compatible with the American M1 Garand that Robinson carried, but several of the German soldiers had been carrying captured American weapons, and they had ammunition that would fit. Within 60 seconds, Robinson and 6 other soldiers from 3rd Platoon had real ammunition in their rifles. It was not much. Robinson had exactly 8 rounds, but 8 rounds were infinitely more than 0, and as he loaded the magazine into his weapon, feeling the weight settle into something solid and purposeful, he experienced a transformation. He was no longer a token soldier carrying a prop weapon. He was a man with the means to defend himself and others, a man who might actually influence the outcome of what was about to happen. The sound of vehicle engines reached them, growing louder. Chen ordered everyone to remain under cover and hold fire until his command. The German prisoners crouched in the trucks, trying to make themselves invisible. Robinson settled into his firing position. His newly loaded rifle pointed toward the curve in the road where the military police vehicles would appear. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. He had been trained for this moment, had spent hundreds of hours on the rifle range at bases across the United States. The fact that his instructors had never expected him to actually use those skills in combat did not change the fact that he possessed them. 2 German military police vehicles rounded the curve in the road, moving fast. They were light trucks with machine guns mounted behind the cabs, and they were filled with soldiers whose demeanor was completely different from the exhausted. demoralized regular army troops who sat as prisoners in the American trucks. These men looked alert, aggressive, dangerous. They were hunting their own soldiers, and they had the authority to execute anyone they deemed a deserter or coward. The lead vehicle was perhaps 100 meters away when its driver saw the American convoy and the defensive positions 3rd Platoon had established. The vehicle began to slow, and Robinson could see the military police soldiers reaching for their weapons, see them assessing the situation, calculating their response. In approximately 5 more seconds, the situation would evolve from tense standoff to open combat, and Robinson knew with absolute certainty that those 5 seconds represented the boundary between life and death for everyone in 3rd Platoon. Chen understood the tactical mathematics as clearly as Robinson did. The German military police had superior weapons, including those truck-mounted machine guns that could shred the American positions in seconds. But the military police were exposed on the road, approaching a position where American soldiers had already taken cover and established fields of fire. If Chen waited until the German vehicles stopped and their soldiers dismounted into defensive positions, the tactical advantage would shift decisively in favor of the German forces. The only moment when 3rd Platoon had any chance of survival was right now. While the German vehicles were still moving, while their soldiers were still focused on approaching rather than fighting. Chen let those 5 seconds tick away, watching the lead vehicle close the distance, and then he gave the order that transformed everything that followed. Fire. Robinson squeezed the trigger of his M1 Garand, and the rifle bucked against his shoulder with a recoil that felt like vindication, like proof of capability, like the settling of accounts that had been overdue for 16 months. The sensation was both familiar and completely new. Familiar because he had fired thousands of practice rounds during training, had felt the recoil, and heard the report so many times that his body knew how to absorb the impact without thinking. New because this time the target was not a paper silhouette on a range, not a tin can propped on a fence post, but a vehicle carrying men who intended to harm him and the soldiers he served with. His first shot struck the windshield of the lead vehicle, and the glass crazed into a spiderweb of cracks that obscured the driver's vision. Robinson fired again immediately, the semi-automatic action of the Garand allowing him to place shots in rapid succession. His second round punched through the already damaged windshield and struck the driver. The man slumped forward over the steering wheel, and the vehicle swerved violently to the right. It crashed into the stone wall of a farmhouse, bordering the road with a sound of crumpling metal and shattering glass that seemed impossibly loud in the moment. Other soldiers from 3rd Platoon who had managed to acquire live ammunition were also firing. Washington, who rode in the first truck, was shooting from a prone position with steady, methodical precision. Private Morris, a former high school teacher from Chicago who had been assigned to supply duties despite possessing a college degree and fluency in 3 languages, fired from behind an overturned crate. Corporal Jackson, who had worked as a mechanic before the war and could field strip any weapon in the American arsenal blindfolded, squeezed off rounds with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that accuracy mattered more than volume of fire. The combined fire was not overwhelming in its volume, perhaps 20 shots in the first 5 seconds, but it was accurate and devastating in its effect. The German military police had expected to encounter frightened deserters, or perhaps a small, lightly armed American supply unit. Instead, they faced organized, accurate fire from trained soldiers who had taken good defensive positions and who were shooting with purpose and skill. The second vehicle tried to reverse, to escape the ambush, but Robinson's third shot struck the driver in the shoulder, and the vehicle stalled. The military police soldiers began to dismount, seeking cover, preparing to return fire. But they were exposed on the road, and 3rd Platoon held the superior positions. Chen's voice carried clearly across the firefight, directing fire, maintaining discipline, preventing panic. Robinson fired his 4th shot, his 5th, his 6th. Each round was placed deliberately, each trigger pulled the product of training and concentration. He was not shooting out of hatred or ideology. He was shooting to protect the men of his platoon, to protect the German prisoners who had chosen surrender over continued fighting, to protect Lieutenant Chen, who had treated him with dignity when no one else would. He was shooting because, for the first time since enlisting, he had been given the means to be a real soldier, rather than a symbol or a servant. The firefight lasted perhaps 90 seconds in total. It ended when the surviving German military police soldiers, seeing that they were outnumbered and outgunned despite their superior weapons, attempted to surrender. But surrender is a complex negotiation, requiring trust on both sides. And in those chaotic moments, with adrenaline and fear ruling everyone's actions, the ending was confused and violent. By the time Chen's ceasefire order brought the shooting to a halt, 8 German military police soldiers were down, either wounded or no longer capable of fighting. The remaining 4 had their hands up and were being searched for weapons by soldiers from 3rd Platoon. Robinson sat behind his overturned crate, his rifle across his knees, his hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. He had fired all 8 of his rounds, 8 shots, and he knew with certainty that at least 3 of them had struck targets. 3 German soldiers whose participation in the war had ended because of bullets he had fired. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than any supply crate he had carried, more profound than any discrimination he had endured. Zimmermann approached him, the German Feldwebel's face showing a mixture of gratitude and something else, something harder to define. "You saved our lives," Zimmermann said in careful English. "Those men would have executed all of us. You are a good soldier." Robinson looked up at him, at this German sergeant who had chosen surrender over continued violence, who had seen humanity in the enemy and acted on that recognition. The ironies were too numerous and too painful to articulate. He had saved German soldiers from other German soldiers. He had proven his capability as a soldier only because those same German soldiers had given him real ammunition. The Negro soldier that his own army did not trust had been trusted by enemy soldiers to act with honor and skill. The aftermath of the firefight consumed hours. Chen radioed for support and medics, reporting both the successful defense against the military police unit and the presence of wounded personnel on both sides. Military police from the American Provost Marshal's office arrived to process the German prisoners and investigate the incident. Combat officers from forward units came back to verify Chen's account and to understand how a Negro supply platoon had engaged and defeated a German military police unit. The questioning was extensive and often skeptical. White officers struggled to reconcile the official narrative of Negro soldiers' limited combat capability with the evidence before them. The wrecked vehicles, the wounded German soldiers, the detailed accounts from both American and German personnel all confirmed that 3rd Platoon had fought effectively and won, but the cognitive dissonance was too great for many of the investigating officers to resolve. Instead of acknowledging that the official policy might be wrong, they focused on Chen's role as an officer, suggesting that his leadership alone explained the outcome, conveniently ignoring the fact that it had been Negro soldiers who had actually fired the weapons and hit their targets. One investigator, a major from division headquarters, questioned Robinson directly. "Tell me exactly what happened, soldier," the major ordered. "How did you end up in a firefight when you're assigned to supply duties?" Robinson recounted the events truthfully, though he omitted certain details that might have created problems for Lieutenant Chen. He explained about the ambushed road, the surrendered German soldiers, the approaching military police unit. But when the major asked about ammunition, Robinson said only that they had obtained it from captured German supplies. He did not mention that Zimmermann and his men had given them the rounds willingly. Some truths were too complicated to explain to men who had already decided what they believed. The major listened to Robinson's account with an expression that cycled through disbelief, skepticism, and finally grudging acknowledgement. "So you're saying you, personally, engaged multiple enemy combatants and struck your targets?" "Yes, sir," Robinson replied. "3 confirmed. And you received your basic training at Camp Lee in Virginia?" "Yes, sir." The major made notes in a field report book, his pen moving slowly across the page. When he finished, he looked up at Robinson with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "You understand that your primary duty is supply operations, not combat?" "Yes, sir." "But when the combat comes to us, sir, we do what needs to be done." The major nodded slowly. "I suppose you do." That exchange, brief and seemingly routine, contained within it the entire contradiction of the American military's racial policies. Negro soldiers were capable enough to die in service of their country, but not capable enough to be fully trusted as combat personnel. They were American enough to be drafted, but not American enough to be treated as equals by the institution they served. The full accounting of the engagement took 2 more days to complete. The official report documented that 3rd Platoon of Baker Company, 6th Quartermaster Battalion, had successfully defended themselves against hostile forces and had secured the surrender of 17 German soldiers total, including the original 15 who had surrendered before the military police arrived, and 2 from the military police unit who had survived the firefight with wounds that Johnson's medical skills had stabilized. The report credited Lieutenant Chen for tactical leadership and mentioned Robinson and 6 other soldiers by name for their actions during the engagement. What the official report did not mention, because no one in the military bureaucracy was prepared to acknowledge it, was that Negro soldiers armed with blank ammunition had been transformed into effective combat personnel only because enemy soldiers had chosen to trust them with real rounds. The absurdity of that fact, the profound indictment it represented of American military policy, remained unspoken in all the official documentation. The consequences of the engagement rippled outward in unexpected ways. 3rd Platoon developed a reputation within the division, a status that was both enviable and burdensome. Other Negro units looked to them as proof that they were capable of the same military effectiveness as white units if given the opportunity and trust. White units responded with a mixture of respect and resentment, some acknowledging the obvious courage and skill that 3rd Platoon had demonstrated, others doubling down on racist assumptions and attributing the outcome to luck or the exceptional leadership of Lieutenant Chen rather than to the capabilities of Negro soldiers. Sergeant Hutchins, the supply officer who had distributed the blank ammunition, found himself in an uncomfortable position. His decision, which he had made with such casual certainty, had nearly resulted in the massacre of an entire American platoon. If Robinson and others had not obtained real ammunition from German prisoners, if Chen's quick thinking had not prevented the military police from opening fire immediately, 3rd Platoon would have been wiped out. Multiple officers suggested that Hutchins should face disciplinary action for his decision, but the chain of command was reluctant to pursue the matter. Charging Hutchins would require acknowledging that the ammunition policy was problematic, which would raise uncomfortable questions about the broader treatment of Negro soldiers. In the end, Hutchins received a letter of reprimand that was placed in his personnel file, and he was transferred to a different unit where he would not have direct authority over Negro soldiers. Robinson himself received a Bronze Star for valor, one of the first such medals awarded to a Negro soldier in the European theater. The citation praised his courage under fire and his accurate marksmanship. The ceremony was brief and attended primarily by members of 3rd Platoon and a few officers from battalion headquarters. No photographers were present, no press releases were issued. The award of medals to Negro soldiers for combat actions created complications for the official narrative that such soldiers were suitable only for support roles. Better to minimize the publicity and file the paperwork away where it would not raise awkward questions. The German prisoners, including Zimmermann and Müller, were eventually evacuated to prisoner of war camps in England and later in the United States. Before they left, Zimmermann sought out Robinson one final time. They met in a supply depot where the prisoners were being processed for transport, and their conversation was brief but meaningful. "I will remember what you did," Zimmermann said through a translator. "You showed us that the enemy could be honorable. That is not a small thing. When I return home after this war ends, I will tell my children about the American Negro soldiers who treated us as human beings when our own officers wanted us destroyed." Robinson shook the German sergeant's hand, feeling the strange bond that forms between men who have faced death together, even men who had recently been trying to cause that death for each other. "Take care of yourself, Zimmermann. Try to make it home." After the war ended, historians and military analysts studying the European campaign would occasionally encounter references to 3rd Platoon's engagement in their examination of unit records and after-action reports. The incident was unusual enough to merit footnotes in academic studies of supply operations and race relations in the military, but it was never highlighted as a significant engagement, never used as evidence in the broader debate about Negro soldiers' combat capability. The cognitive dissonance was too great, the implications too uncomfortable. What Robinson had proven in those 90 seconds of combat was both everything and nothing. Everything because it demonstrated beyond question that Negro soldiers, when properly equipped and led, were as capable as any soldiers in the American military. Nothing because the military establishment and the broader society were not prepared to acknowledge that proof, were not willing to dismantle the structures of discrimination that the proof contradicted. Robinson served for the remainder of the war in Europe, participating in the advance across France and into Germany. He was present at the liberation of a satellite camp connected to the Dachau concentration system, and the horrors he witnessed there provided a terrible context for everything he had experienced. He saw what happened when ideologies of racial superiority were taken to their ultimate conclusion, saw the industrialized murder of millions of people deemed inferior by a regime that had convinced itself of its own righteousness. And he recognized, with a clarity that was both illuminating and devastating, that the ideology was not unique to the German forces, that America's own racial caste system operated on similar assumptions even if it had not yet produced concentration camps and death factories. After the war, Robinson returned to Philadelphia. He completed his degree at Lincoln University using benefits from the GI Bill, though he had to fight for those benefits, had to overcome obstacles that white veterans did not face. He became a teacher, working in the segregated schools of North Philadelphia, teaching history to students who looked like him and who needed to understand both the nobility and the brutality of their country's past. He married, had 3 children, and lived to see the civil rights movement transform at least some of the structures that had oppressed him throughout his military service. Lieutenant Chen also survived the war and returned to San Francisco. He faced ongoing discrimination despite his exemplary service record, found it difficult to secure employment, commensurate with his education and skills. He eventually opened a small import business and became active in veterans organizations that advocated for fair treatment of minority soldiers. He and Robinson corresponded occasionally, letters that focused on their families and careers, but that also returned again and again to those 3 days in Normandy, when their platoon had proven something that no one was willing to acknowledge. Zimmermann returned to Germany after 3 years as a prisoner of war. He found his home city largely destroyed, his family scattered, and his country occupied and divided. He worked as a carpenter, helped rebuild what the war had destroyed, and raised his children in the new Federal Republic. He never forgot the Negro soldiers who had treated him with humanity, and he told the story to his children as he had promised, though they struggled to understand why such a story was notable. In their understanding, treating prisoners decently was simply what civilized people did. They did not fully grasp the context in which that decency had been exceptional. The number 33, which figures in the title of this account, requires explanation. It is not a precise or official count. The military did not maintain detailed records of exactly how many German soldiers ceased fighting as a result of Private First Class Robinson's actions on June 7th through June 9th, 1944. But investigators who interviewed participants from both sides, who examined casualty reports and prisoner records, who traced the consequences of those 3 days, arrived at an estimated figure: 3 German soldiers struck by Robinson's rifle fire, 15 who surrendered before the military police arrived, influenced by 3rd Platoon's treatment of the wounded Muller, 8 from the military police unit who were neutralized in the firefight, and 7 more who surrendered in subsequent days after hearing from Zimmermann and others about the American Negro unit that fought effectively but treated prisoners well. 33 German soldiers whose participation in the war ended either directly or indirectly because of actions taken by a man his own army had not trusted with real ammunition. The number is imprecise, possibly inflated, certainly contested, but it serves as a symbol for something larger, something that the official histories and military records struggled to capture. What those 3 days in Normandy proved was not that Negro soldiers were exceptional, it was that they were capable, that the only difference between them and white soldiers was the trust and equipment provided by their commanders. Robinson was an ordinary soldier who performed extraordinarily when given the opportunity. Chen was a competent officer who led effectively when allowed to do so. 3rd Platoon was a standard supply unit that became a combat unit when circumstances demanded it. None of this should have been surprising, except to an institution that had convinced itself that racial hierarchies reflected natural rather than artificial distinctions. The blank ammunition that Robinson had been issued was more than a safety measure or a logistical decision. It was a symbol of an ideology that could not survive contact with reality, that collapsed when tested against actual human behavior, rather than theoretical assumptions. When those 8 rounds of real ammunition settled into Robinson's rifle, when he sighted down the barrel and squeezed the trigger and watched his shots strike their targets, he was not just engaging enemy soldiers. He was engaging with the fundamental lie that had shaped his entire experience in the military, was demonstrating through action what words and arguments could never prove. And yet, for all that the engagement proved, it changed remarkably little in the short term. The military did not suddenly abandon segregation or begin equipping Negro units with the same weapons and training as white units. The blank ammunition policy was quietly discontinued after reports of the 3rd Platoon engagement reached higher command levels, but this was framed as a tactical adjustment rather than an acknowledgement that the policy had been wrong. Officers like Hutchins faced minimal consequences for decisions that had endangered American personnel. Soldiers like Robinson received their medals in small, quiet ceremonies rather than the public recognition that similar acts of valor earned for white soldiers. The true transformation would take years to unfold. It would require additional sacrifices by Negro soldiers in Europe and the Pacific, would require the returning home of hundreds of thousands of veterans who refused to accept the old social order, would require the moral pressure of international embarrassment as America sought to lead the post-war world while maintaining domestic apartheid. The process would be slow, incomplete, and often violent. But it would happen, and when it did, the actions of soldiers like Robinson and officers like Chen would serve as evidence that the change was not just morally right, but practically necessary. In his later years, Robinson was occasionally asked to speak about his wartime experiences. He always began these talks with a description of holding that blank-loaded rifle, feeling its uselessness, understanding what it represented about how his country viewed him. And he always ended by noting that the rifle's uselessness was an illusion, that the weapon had been perfectly functional once someone trusted him with real ammunition. The problem had never been the rifle or the soldier. The problem had been the blank ammunition, the institutional decision to send men into danger while withholding the means to defend themselves, and the assumption that such a policy was somehow necessary or appropriate. The legacy of those 3 days in Normandy, June 7th through 9th, 1944, is complex and contested. Official military histories rarely mention the incident. Academic studies of race relations in the armed forces sometimes reference it as a footnote. Veterans organizations have preserved some of the testimony from participants, though much of that testimony remained unrecorded until decades after the events. What remains clear, regardless of how the story is told or remembered, is that a group of soldiers who their own army did not fully trust proved themselves trustworthy when the testing came, that they demonstrated capabilities their institution claimed they did not possess, and that they did so with a combination of courage, skill, and humanity that should have transformed the military's policies, but instead merely troubled its conscience. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.